My name is Robert Poteat. Studying the monetary situation for about 33 years. First two before to hit me between the eyes was in 1971 when Nixon declared a wage and price freeze. Couldn't understand where he got the authority to do that. Closed the gold window. I had no idea what that was. But in 1981, a piece of paper fell into my hand to describe the monetary situation. Couldn't believe it. Said, set out and prove for myself what it was. And the more I got into history, the more I began to learn what a lot of us have already learned. We've been lied to all our lives about everything. In studying the monetary situation, I learned what the relationship was to war, and that sort of backed me into the peace movement. So I'm here today to talk about what perhaps should be called the political economy of militarism, maybe a little more obvious: war drives debt and debt drives war. When I do this for civilian audiences, I start out with a lot of shock. But I'm going to skip over most of that because I think all of us here as the Veterans for Peace understand the depth of the tragedy and trauma that this causes around the world. But I would like to point out one website at the bottom of this slide. It's the best collection of military interventions that I know of, and you can find it by searching Alrighty Comrades. I started out once to make a web page like this, and I got sick doing it and never finished it. But this guy has done it, so I don't have to bother with it anymore. So we'll skip through all this stuff of the tragedy of war, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Agent Orange, depleted uranium, because I think you're all familiar with it. You should know about it. All the refugees and the problems that that causes throughout the world. Here we are in a time when there's never been so much opportunity for human development. We reach to the planets, plumb the oceans, examine the smallest subatomic particles, manipulate DNA, and then use our technology to create the worst weapons of mass destruction that's ever been conceived by man, and we use them. And it's our country. We are doing it. The United States has engaged in a war-driven economy since 1939. The employment at waste is used to compensate for the inherent flaws of the capitalist system based on using debt as money. War is a business. There's no incentive to win wars. If one ends, there must be another to take its place. How do we come to this? How do we get to be a war economy? Before we go into that, I'd like to discuss a little bit what is money. Aristotle gave us a definition a couple of thousand years ago. Money exists not by nature but by law. The best definition was given by Alexander Del Mar, the greatest monetary historian who ever lived. What is commonly understood as money has always consisted tangibly of a number of pieces of some material marked by public authority and named or understood in the laws or customs. That is, palpable characteristic was its mark of authority. Its essential characteristic, the possession of the value defined by law. In its function, the legal power to pay debts and taxes, and the mechanical power to facilitate the exchange of objects possessing value. It is therefore not a commodity, although bits of commodity like gold and silver have been used as monetary counters. It is not wealth, although it can claim some wealth. It is an abstract social power embodied in law. Aristotle went on to say we can do anything we want with it. We can do anything we want with it. So what is our money? How does it manifest? Coins produced by the United States Mint, and they're issued into circulation by the United States government. This is our only, what I would call, real money. It's issued debt and interest-free. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Clause 5, Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value. So this is the only good money, but it's insignificant, so forget it. Paper money. Federal Reserve note. Can somebody tell me what note means in this context? IOU. It's a piece of debt. This is a bank note issued by Federal Reserve banks and is based on owning United States Treasury securities. Therefore, we're in debt for this. It's a gigantic fraud. But we'll get to that. Again, this probably doesn't represent more than 1 or 2% of the legal economy. Forget it. So how do we transact? It's just numbers in a bank account, transferred by computers. That's what our money is. Where does that come from? They're created by banks as deposit interest when they make loans. You've probably heard the expression, created out of thin air, created out of nothing. It's true. The Federal Reserve creates the original money by buying some asset. It creates that money as a deposit entry, a bookkeeping entry, typically Treasury securities, but today it's buying all sorts of junk. That becomes the reserves on which your commercial banks extend loans, and that's where about 90% of our money is created. The Federal Reserve banks, actually it's all carried out in the New York Federal Reserve Bank, buys assets, which it buys by creating bookkeeping entries. These become the so-called reserves on which your commercial banks make loans through this fractional reserve banking expansion. That's where your bookkeeping entries come from. Most of that so-called deposit money is created by your commercial banks when they lend you money for your house, your car, your credit card. They do not lend you money that they have. They create the money as deposit interest when you take out a loan. So how did we get here? William III borrowed 1,200,000 pounds in gold from a consortium to make war against European Catholics, and he gave the consortium the power to found a bank, the Bank of England, with the privilege of creating banknotes to the amount of the loan. The Parliament voted to pay the interest on the loan. The bank gets interest on the loan twice because they create their banknotes out of interest and lend them. And this is of significance because this was the beginning of the debt cycle that we're in now. Eventually, these banknotes were made legal tender. That is, the government guaranteed the banknotes, backed them up with the credit of the sovereign nation. The expression is full faith and credit. It means that they promised to make the banknotes good if the bank failed. And that fraud is in common practice all over the world today, including Federal Reserve notes in the United States. It is a moral and intellectual fraud for a nation to back private debt with the full faith and credit of the nation. It's a graph of English finances published in 1805. Uses a slightly different nomenclature than we use today. It started the exponential growth of debt with the accession of William III and the founding of the Bank of England. Borrowing money to make war is easier than collecting all the taxes at once, right? You can slip the yoke of interest on the people much more easily than you can get all that money for war at once. So we're going to develop the long-term effects of that. And although the American revolutionaries issued their own paper currency, They also borrowed, and after the Constitution was written, the government assumed a debt of $75 million from the government under the Articles of Confederation that had fought the war. People in the new government with banking interests, particularly Alexander Hamilton, for example, went to work to found a bank like the Bank of England to issue private credit to finance the nation. It was founded in 1791, called the First Bank of the United States. And of course, credit is debt, and the yoke of debt was cleverly slipped onto the nation by private financiers, and it began with war debt. And this pernicious practice of monetizing government debt for private profit has resulted in a public debt of over $17 trillion. The scale of debt is so large that if I scale this map for 1 inch to equal $1 million, it would reach in outer space. I love this guy, James Jackson, the first congressman from the state of Georgia. When the debate for the first bank was going on, he told them exactly what would happen. As you can see, it did. So if we use a nonlinear vertical scale, we can see better the exponential growth of debt throughout United States history. This indicates debt bubbles created by major wars. We can see better detail with slicing the debt and time scaled into minor segments. This is the bubble for the War of 18 and 12. It also shows the end of the second bank when Jackson essentially paid off the United States debt and created one of the Great Depressions. This is the debt bubble for the Mexican-American War, for the Civil War. This is the relatively largest increase in the United States debt. Went from about 65 million in 1860 to 2.8 billion in 1866, and the official debt record includes United States notes called greenbacks. Now, some people like to say that the Civil War was fought with Lincoln greenbacks. Greenback was a name given to paper money issued by the United States Congress for the obvious reason the backside was printed with green ink, and the U.S. notes called greenbacks issued debt and interest-free against the sovereign credit of the nation, and the total issue of sovereign money, including fractional notes and postage stamps that were used as money, never exceeded 500 million. So you can see that more than 2 billion were borrowed. Actually, Lincoln did not favor the issue of greenbacks, and he signed an act creating the national banks, which was another way of reverting to that pernicious practice of monetizing government debt for private profit. It required the national banks to hold treasury securities in the amount of their banknote issue. It also taxed state banknotes, effectively giving the national banks a monopoly on banknote issue. After the Civil War, national debt rippled downward until 1892 and started back up again. The Spanish-American War used so few resources and was over so quickly it didn't really create a debt bubble. And it continued to ripple up until World War I. And this created approximately a 9 times increase in the national debt. Of all time is Alexander Delmar's Little History of Monetary Crimes. It's one of my favorite books. Woodrow Wilson was reelected in 1916, financed mostly by J.P. Morgan, and he used the slogan, he kept us out of war. Remember, World War I had already started in Europe. But in April of 1917, then he turned right around and asked for a declaration of war and got it. Primarily, J.P. Morgan had lent billions to France and England. They were broke and they were fighting Germany. And that money had been used to turn around and buy war material from the United States, which was illegal under international law. Russia collapsed into communism, and Germany only had one front to fight. J.P. Morgan was afraid Germany would win, he'd go broke. He convinced Wilson that this would destroy the U.S. economy, so Wilson took the country to war to save criminal bankers. World War II approximately sextupled the national debt. Now, if we summarize all the war debts up until that time, it approximately equals the total national debt in 1946. So war debt wiped out all of the debt increases. We go back to the Mexican-American War. We noticed that the national debt went down after that, but it never did go to zero. So we are still paying interest on debt accumulated during the Mexican-American War and everything since. Ipso facto, war drives debt. So we'll take up the subject a little bit of debt driving war. The Korean War and Vietnam War caused no debt bubble, nor did the later conflict. To understand this, we have to go back to the Great Depression. We go back to the Great Depression. John Maynard Keynes' solution to this was government deficit spending. He was an influential economist with banking ties, and Franklin Roosevelt was an investment banker. Deficit spending became known as Keynesianism. It's not hard to see whose interests are served when the government borrows privately issued debt. When asked what the long-run effect would be, Keynes answered, "In the long run, we are all dead." He knew exactly what he was doing. Deficit spending for World War II created an economic boom, ending the Depression. That statement is often debated, but Paul Volcker, former chairman of the board of the governors of the Federal Reserve System, statistics, and I confirm it. I lived through that time, I saw it, and that boom confirmed the efficacy of deficit spending to stimulate the economy. The demobilization at the end of the war ended the huge deficit spending, released millions of men looking for work. Recession followed. The Cold War and Korean War, called a police action, provided the opportunity to co-opt deficit spending for war permanently. President Eisenhower warned about it early on. His warning was incomplete. He spoke a half-truth. Eisenhower omitted the most important element of the complex, the financial element, without which the others could not be. I do not know if that half-truth was deliberate, but I do know that the half-truth is a well-used technique of propaganda. We don't see war debt bubbles after World War II because we have been on a war economy ever since. It is a continuous war debt bubble. Troops remained in Europe and Japan until this day. The same with the Korean War. The exception is Vietnam because we were kicked out in defeat. Military expansion has bases 750 or more. I don't know if anybody knows the real count. So that military spending flows seamlessly from preparations for war to war. This little book is an excellent analysis of the militarized political economy. Social spending edition since the Great Depression create a never-ending quarrel about the reasons for the ever-growing debt. Comparisons of military versus social spending shows that military spending vastly exceeds social spending, but it is a false argument. The problem is the system itself, and it does not matter what you spend on, you will run the debt up. When veterans of benefits and military agendas of other agencies, such as the CIA, NSA, NASA, State Department, DHS, etc., are added to the Pentagon budget, more than half the federal budget is spent on militarism. Some of the visible characteristics of militarism as political economy are that it requires enemies and it will create them when needed. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there were terrorists everywhere. A war on terrorism was declared. A war on a strategy or idea can never be won. It is a war that is easy to continue ad infinitum with propaganda and false flags. Military professionals need war on their resumes to advance their careers. Did you notice the chest of General Petraeus? If he had all those medals on, he couldn't stand up. War production and civilian employment on military bases creates millions of jobs. Besides the direct military service, military expenditures produce demand as wages in the market with nothing for the public to buy. It is ideal Keynesianism. War contracts are a big pork barrel for congresspersons. Sometimes Congress votes for projects the military did not ask for. War profits provide the resources to bribe congresspersons with campaign contributions. Military research contracts corrupt educational institutions. Deficit spending is more palatable under conditions of fear and threat created by war propaganda. Military suppliers, General Electric, the big one, owns media, NBC. More censorship can be achieved through control of advertising revenue and interlocking boards of directors. Deficit spending helps provide aggregate demand to help sustain the unsustainable debt-driven economy. And militarism leads to costly and inefficient military adventurism. Iraq's petroleum was cheap and easily available without war. Retail price of gasoline is about $1.60 now, it's $4 and more. But when the trillions of dollars spent on war, unnecessary war, are added, the cost of gasoline is much higher than that pump price. And here's another killer. The unnecessary public debt leads to an unnecessary and absolutely foolish interest expense, more than $2 trillion in the last 5 fiscal years. War is the largest driver of unnecessary public debt, but the debt system creates larger debt in the private sector. This aggregation of debt is coincident with the unconscionable maldistribution of wealth and resultant social chaos. The private and government debt result in prices of everything you buy being as much as 30% higher than they would be otherwise, and in housing it may be 70%. And despite all that, the unstable economy of contractions and expansions continues apace. We have had 48 of them since the founding of the country. You're right, there are many, 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 many things that we could do better. I have a friend of mine who describes it as trimming poison ivy. You know, you can trim the poison ivy back, but if you don't kill it, it grows right back. A good example of that would be Glass-Steagall. Passed in the 1930s, it took them until 1999 to get rid of it, but they got rid of it. See, it grew back. So you can do all these little things that would, yes, it'd be better, all kinds of little things. But I've spent the last 33 years going to the heart of this system, and that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing. And until we do that, we're not going to get peace. We're not going to get social justice. I mean, political speech it was, but William Jennings Bryan made the point in 1896. Of course, there have been some improvements in various things, race and gender, I hope. We've made some progress in some of these things. But if you look at the debt and the war thing, it just gets worse and worse and worse. We're not making any progress. Sorry, Veterans for Peace and anyone else, we are not beating the system, and we cannot continue to do the same things we're doing because we'll get the same results. So we don't get lost in all the stuff. It's the banks who lend the money, the military suppliers, and the media conglomerates form an interconnected control system of war, supply, and information control. Concentration of wealth through privately issued debt means tightly controlled ownership of the means of production and communication and political parties. This is something we have to face. And I resigned from the Democratic Party, but that's not the issue. They're both corrupt. They're both owned by the corporations. In fact, and this is the crucial element you have to understand, whoever issues the money controls the nation. And that's what we have to go after. And debt created by war has been a big factor. The dance of death, debt, and destruction. I'm afraid the phrase human civilization is an oxymoron until we end these two moral and intellectual desecrations, war and end it. And this is what we can do about it. Since 2005, I've been associated with the American Monetary Institute. If you want to inform yourself on history, monetary systems, and et cetera, this is the best single book, but it in itself is not enough, but the bibliography, Stephen Zarlinga. But the last chapter of the book It's called the American Monetary Act. And the genesis of the act was the Chicago Plan, written by some economists at the University of Chicago during the 1930s, but of course it did not get instituted. Keynesianism was put in because Roosevelt was an investment banker, among other reasons. But we refined it, improved it, gave it to Dennis Kucinich, and he introduced it into the 111th Congress as H.R. 6550 and H.R. 2990 in the 112th Congress. He's been gerrymandered out. We no longer have a sponsor. What this act would do, it would fold the good parts of the Federal Reserve System into the Treasury. The Treasury would issue our money, debt and interest free. The power of banks to lend credit, to create credit, would be ended, period. It would immediately give the citizens a dividend. We suggested $10,000 to start. We would invest immediately in infrastructure. The National Association of Engineers put out a report periodically every 4 or 5 years. We need about $2.6 trillion now in repairs to our infrastructure, our roads, our dams, and everything. They rate as a D, the supposedly greatest country in the world with a D for infrastructure. Put pressure on your Congress people any way you can. This would restore the power of Congress to control the money issue and stop banks from creating credit. They would still be able to operate as depository institutions. But then the big change, the only change you would see as a depositor, is that if you give them your money in a savings account to invest for you, it will not be immediately available. It will be invested. Now they pretend they're investing it, but you can have it back anytime you want it. They don't really invest it, they just create new credit.